Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you for taking the time to join us today. My name is Charles Thomas. I'm the Director of Anti-Bribery and Corruption at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and I'm going to be hosting this session today. During our time today, we intend to discuss a wide variety of issues, primarily details of Know Your Customer and due diligence requirements, including recent guidance from FinCEN, Department of Justice, and others. How to source and use the best data for an efficient KYC and third-party due diligence workflow, developing accurate name matching processes to get the right balance of accurate results and also reduction of both false positives and false negatives, and also making the most of technology and machine learning, things which are becoming a real help in what we must say is a fast-changing and at times fluid compliance environment. Before we begin, however, I did want to cover just a few small housekeeping elements, if I may. Firstly, if you have any technical connectivity issues or can't see the screen or things are frozen, there is a Q&A link at the bottom of the screen in front of you, and a representative from the webcast firm we're working with, On24, is available. So please just drop a question or drop a comment into the Q&A. Someone will pick that up and help you out. We are going to be recording this session, and it will be made available to all shortly after we've finished recording. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we do intend to leave some time at the end of the session for questions and answers. I know it seems an age since we were all sitting in a room and we could simply raise our hands and pick out someone for a question. Technology does sort of help us in this new work from home world. Again, the question and answer section at the bottom of the page, please do click on that, send through any questions you have as we go through. We'd very much welcome any and all questions, obviously, but please accept my and our apologies in advance if we're unable to answer all of those. Now, just a few moments ago, before I put up the on-air sign outside my study door, my children came into the room and asked me, Daddy, what are you doing on the phone this afternoon? They obviously know that I sit and talk to people on the phone around the world. So I replied that my job today was mainly to introduce two speakers who are far cleverer than I am. My children laughed and left the room. Now, I'm not entirely sure how I feel about that, but again, that is really my task today. So today, I'd like to start by introducing two colleagues who are going to be speaking with me today. Firstly, Lorena Esparza. Lorena is a graduate of the University of Dayton School of Law, with almost 2 decades of experience in information solution and financial crime compliance. At LexisNexis Risk Solutions, she uses her experience to help clients develop, implement, and manage risk management and compliance programs to ensure they work in compliance with requirements globally. Secondly, further to that, I should mention that as an attorney, Lorena maintains her legal skills by doing pro bono work with the Greater Dayton Volunteer Lawyers Project. Secondly, Dr. Michelle Frazier is joining us. Michelle is the Director of Global Content here at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, and as such, she provides leadership on issues such as data inclusion criteria, documentation, training of researchers, quality assurance and performance, and a key element is the data protection compliance piece. Prior to joining us, she was an academic examining finance, data transfers and terrorism from a policymaking, legal and enforcement perspective. So without further ado, Michelle, I'll hand over to you for the first section.
Thank you, Charlie, and welcome everyone. So I think everyone is familiar with the KYC, Know Your Customer processes. It's a term often used interchangeably with customer due diligence and its close cousin, enhanced due diligence, and it really encompasses at core these 4 elements. It's about understanding and mapping networks and relationships and actions through data, and you're going to hear me saying this, mapping networks and relationships, over and over during this presentation. We're looking here at the collection and verification of customer data, and the foundations of any good KYC program is good data that's managed with efficient screening and risk management tools. So, in my portion of the talk today, I'm going to focus on the data part, and Lorena is going to be looking at the screening and the match tools. So, If you look at any KYC regulation, and in front of you is the 2016 FinCEN reg, we could easily look at European Union's Fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, and you'll see some of the same elements. This reflects the standard practices with the 4 KYC elements on the previous slide, albeit with some more details. So at core, you have identify and verify, right? Collecting information about your clients and verifying that. And then looking at the ongoing relationship, the monitoring, the suspicious transactions, and then constantly tuning them and retuning them to the customer risk profiles to understand the nature and the purpose of the relationship that you have. Now, the additional details that you see here is really part of what I like to think is an evolution of KYC. So we have the customer identity, but then you have this beneficial owners and companies, right? And we have a call out there in green when you're looking at beneficial ownership. Identify and verify anyone who owns a threshold of 25% of a legal entity. So you're talking about not just ownership, but control. So we start to see that KYC in a lot of ways is getting deeper. And so we've gone from KYC, know your customer, to KYCC, know your customer's customer, to KYB, know your business. And again, we go back to mapping those networks. KYC isn't just anymore about the person sitting in front of you and maybe their immediate relationships. You are looking at KYCC, or your growing risk of fraud in your second-tier business relationships, knowing that the person sitting in front of you and their business, understanding their supply chains, knowing what they're doing so you can see your associated risk levels of doing business with them and then who they are doing business with. And then KYB, know your business, again, and now a growing risk of fake businesses and shell companies, which in many parts of the world are prohibited. Looking for that verification of registration and those credentials, depending on the location. Again, understanding ultimate beneficial owners of that business and so on, and being able to screen that business against blacklists and gray lists to check out that criminal activity. So in order to map these networks, to understand these relationships, to know your customer, your customer's customer, and your business, you need the data to do that. And so that brings us to the KYC data. You have 3 elements here, really, 3 buckets of data, I'm going to say broadly. One is the data that you get from your client. That's your checklist. You're sitting in front of someone, or you just have a checklist of this is what I need to know about you to establish that business relationship, right? It's a checklist of name, date of birth, what documents that you need. But you're doing this not just because of a compliance reason. You're doing this because you're establishing this business relationship. How can our services help you, right? So you're gathering that information for many reasons here. And secondly, you see a relatively new phenomenon when you're looking at KYC utilities. There's 2 really, I would call, grand experiments that I know I'm watching, and I know the world is watching, and the compliance world is watching, which is the Dutch banks and the Nordic experiments, where you have these banks that are sharing their KYC data to lower the burden on clients and to get a better idea of the rapid changes in business that are happening, like UBO changes. This spurs the questions onto your clients and saying, oh, well, we found this additional information. Let's have a conversation so we can, A, better serve you and understand the nature of your business, but then also, of course, in a compliance sense, understand our risk. So I think everyone's very curious to see how these banks not only were successful, if they're successful in sharing this data, but then also how they managed and used this data to kind of like standardize the risk perhaps across their businesses. And then lastly, which is really the topic of the conversation today and my focus, is vendor data. So vendor data, incredibly important, because this is really, and you see this mentioned in many, many instances of regulatory guidance, of having that third party, that independent verification of not only your client data, but a way to give you extra information that may not have been presented or you may not have known about it, whether it be an enforcement or regulatory action or media, a negative media that is related to AML, CFT, and ABC concerns. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about data methodology. A lot of people say, oh, methodology, oh, it's so boring, it's so academic. And yes, it can be, but it can be exciting. I can convince you of this. So methodology is so important to data collection because it's really your system of principles and rules that govern what data is collected and why it's collected. And that methodology must be repeatable and testable and allow for variations with consistency. Now that last part, allow for variations with consistency, might sound counterintuitive, right? But it's really not. Take, for example, when you're thinking about state-owned enterprises, right? So, gee, how do you define corporate structures? And corporate structures around the world can be very, very different in terms of state ownership. But there are some consistencies among them. And as long as your methodology lays out those consistencies in a very logical manner, and I can apply maybe those weird cases to it and note what exceptions are, but then incorporate them and tell you why they're exceptions or why they fit, that's a strong standard methodology. So your vendor should be able to explain those inclusion criteria to you. Here's the logic of why we included this, and this is what's included and what isn't. Because that's really important for you to understand not only the data that you're getting, but then also how it aligns with your understanding of your own internal data and screening. So let's go over some of these data methodologies and give you some questions to ask. So definitions. Look at the definitions of subcategories and categories. Do they say what they include and what they exclude? Do they reflect regulatory and legal language of considerations? So we look into all the different legal language, like how is corruption defined here, how is it defined here. You incorporate that, again, to create a global standard. You also want to make sure that the subcategory definitions differentiate and you have some granularity there. Like take, for example, there's lots of different types of fraud, but bank fraud, mortgage fraud, wire fraud have there's distinctions between them. Having data that splits them up helps you in your screening as well. Note the subcategories of predicate offenses as well. Predicate offenses are very important. They're also put in the legislation. Talk about source credibility. Credibility, you should have technical and manual processes to determine credibility, like blacklists and whitelists. Wikipedia out. Definitely anyone can alter that. You should have a approved list of government sources, international organization, certain media outlets that you know have journalistic integrity and credibility. Those sites should use neutral language. You should look at the about pages. You should teach things like research methods, making sure that people understand the difference between just someone's blog and a credible news source. That really gets you into adverse media inclusion, what the criteria under negative news is included. The credibility of that news is important, but also the stages that those items are included. Like, do you have to just be indicted or can you be investigated? Because there's a long process to, if they're investigated or they're suspected or whatnot, some investigations can go on for a while, and then they're getting more and more information. That should be included to give you the best view of what's happening. And this is something that FinCEN really focused on in its 2020 guidance a few weeks ago. Standardization, translation of names, date standardization. A lot of places in the world do day, month, year instead of month, day, year. Spelling out the month goes a very long way in making sure that that is consistent. Transliteration, simplified and traditional Chinese, standards of Arabic for names, and create standard inclusion principles. A question I get all the time: politically exposed persons. So what's your definition of politically exposed persons? How can you tell that there's prominence? So a lot of people think, I mean, yes, there's definite unique government structures around the world. No government is exactly alike. But what's interesting is when you look at the structure of states, nation states and countries, those structures actually follow a really prescribed standardization. You have a national government, then a subnational, and then you have these strata of governance and governing institutions that fit in between, that fit in each of those. So if I'm higher up on the governmental pole there, meaning I have a national position in a parliament or I'm a chief of state, my risk or my influence might be higher because I can affect more decisions. I have more access to resources. So it's not just the definitions, which might be more suitable to roles as someone's in the military or in the diplomatic corps. You also want to look at how well does your vendor understand the structure of government and power. Effective starting and end dates for positions is very important here when you can locate them. Remember that in most regulation you have screening for 12 to 18 months, right? So that's a minimum. So take, for example, and Fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, you have a minimum of screening for 12 months against PEPs. And then after that, it's really up to the financial institution whether or not they want to consider screening against that PEP. So having the most complete start and end dates for positions is very important because that will help you in your screening and it will help you target your resources. Percentages. Of course, this is very important for state-owned enterprises and ultimate beneficial ownership. What are the thresholds and why that are collected? Those should be rooted in the regulation. You know, is it, say, everyone has to have a straight 25%, or is it the aggregate? Can you have multiple people reach that 25%, and then that fits inclusion? And what are the criteria around that? Also look at how deeply they're going, meaning that, so if I have a state-owned enterprise, you're looking at board of directors, right, like senior decision makers. These are the people that determine the strategy, which is fundamentally important to the corporation. You might say, we're going to create widgets, right? And all the widgets are going to be blue and we're going to make them in this certain country. But then after that, they hand over those plans and the money to the day-to-day managers of the operations themselves. And they're the ones handling the money. And so there may be risks there as well. We need to know who those people are. Golden shares. Veto, you might have a minority stake in a company, but you still have veto. Is that marked as well? Understanding those types of percentages and inclusions. Personally identifiable information, PII. This is a hot button issue for a lot of people because they, you know, this is what is really going to help you differentiate, having those personal identifiers to differentiate between what's in a database and what a client holds. Now, this is going to, the availability of the information, especially for open source, is going to vary because there will be restrictions on some of this information. In some countries, you can't publish people's dates of birth or addresses. But at the same time, that the vendor should know about that. They should have a really good data-driven idea of fill rates and why they are the way that they are. And then lastly, and relationships. Everything I've talked about in this data methodology slide has been about relationships, having those network views. And you want to look at those connections. Does the data map those connections? Does it look at relationships? How deeply to the degree does it go with those corporations and those individuals? You know, how deeply those family ties are. Is it just looking at brothers and sisters or immediate family? Does it look at cousins? Is it looking at how deep the connections are between state-owned enterprises and their investment companies and subsidiaries? That's the type of view that would be very helpful for KYCC and KYB especially. And lastly, I want to talk about notes on process. So one of the things I've noticed is that people are very, very interested in methodology, which I said is fundamentally important. Those systems and principles of rules of how data is collected and why is absolutely important. But process is the backbone of that methodology, right? These are ingrained actions that inform the method and constantly improve and give you those feedback loops to improve the methodology. So you should also be asking about those processes. What about training? How often are people trained? How often are your researchers trained? What does that training entail? And how are they assessed before they get to move on? I think all of us have been in a compliance training where you just kind of like sit through a whole bunch of slides and you're going, okay, yeah, I get it. But how can you tell and measure that someone is actually understanding what you put in front of them? So they should have assessment procedures. This leads to, of course, quality assurance. There should be human and technical processes for quality assurance. You know, do you know your error rates for certain things? Are you tracking people? Can you prove it? Your controls are really telling you should be making data-driven improvements on your processes, knowing what's going in your database and how. So you can target maybe researchers, take for example, if they're having a hard time with a certain policy, or illuminate a policy inconsistency. That will help you improve that methodology. So it's constant improvement. Data protection, huge issue. Huge concern for a lot of people. They're saying, well, you know, is data protection, how much of an impact does it have on my operations? You should be asking your vendor, what's your attitude towards compliance, right? What provisions do you have in place for handling access rights? This should not be seen as an inhibitor of good data. This is actually an advantage of good data. If someone writes to you and they say, you know, you have something inaccurate, you want to stop, you want to look at what they're saying, they could be providing you information that you didn't have, you want to verify that. You want to make sure that you have a balance between that person's individual rights, but also your obligations to provide the best possible AML, CFT, and ABC data possible, because the financial institutions don't need all the data. They need that targeted data. They need that correct data to make those decisions. And so you should be asking, so what are your criteria for removals and edits in these cases? And then lastly, timeliness of information. Current data. How often is your data updated? Do you have technical and manual review processes? What technologies are you using to determine new information that's coming in? How often are you looking at your categories for, say, new regulation and other reviews? Again, data-driven improvements. Your vendor should be looking at these processes and saying, this is how I improve. This is how I identify gaps. This is how I put feedback loops into these processes, into my methodologies. So I hope I've given you some critical criteria to consider not only for vendors, but in your own data collection. And I thank you for your attention. And now I'm going to hand that over to Charlie.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michelle. I think a couple of key points that come out there. One of those is there's an old English saying of, may you live in interesting times, which comes from all sorts of places. It's fair to say that over the past few months, we've all been living in interesting times. And you mentioned the concept of new regulations, monitoring, retuning, rechecking. it's very much been the case that the landscape of compliance has, over recent months, been quite fluid. But as well as that, the landscape of the data has also been very much fluid, with changes, with moves, with people leaving jobs, companies going out of business, coming into business. I think it's been probably a more volatile period than we've seen in many years. And I think if there was one key takeaway, which is a fantastic way of looking both at internal processes, but also your own processes as a compliance unit, it's the little catchphrase of variations with consistency. I think if we can all apply variations with consistency, I think we're going to get to a very good point. Before I go ahead and introduce Lorena's piece, please do continue to ask any questions you may have via the Q&A. And as well, if you do have any technical questions, again, please pop those in there and we will address those. When thinking about an effective screening process, an effective due diligence process, I was trying to find an illustration or a way of humanizing and tying things together. And frankly, I think it's fairly obvious. The data side of it is effectively fuel. That fuel can be extracted, drilled, brought out from wherever it is. So you extract it, you can refine it, and you can work on it until it's very much the best you can have. However, fuel on its own isn't really much use. If you look at petrol, it sits in tanks and doesn't really do much until you need to use that to power something, to power an engine. Now, that engine can be refined to be as efficient and effective as possible, but the engine itself is only really as good as the fuel that's driving it. So the two really need to come together and work on that. So, as Michelle has covered the fuel element of this analogy, if you will, I'd now like to move on to Lorena to discuss what we'll call in this case the engine side of the process.
Thank you, Charlie.
Over to you.
And perfect. I love that analogy. This concept of, you may have the greatest vehicle in the world, but you still need the right fuel to drive that forward, to get you to your ultimate destination. And so Michelle's overview on KYC data and data methodology is really just one piece of the puzzle. So like Charlie was sort of laying up here for this transition, effective KYC screening and frankly, risk and compliance screening in general requires not only accurate data preparation from the vendor side, but also from the input side, but also you need a sophisticated name matching technology with customizable workflows to help your organization effectively and efficiently balance regulatory risk against other factors like customer satisfaction and operation costs. So today, for the remaining part of our presentation today, I'm going to share an overview of name matching challenges and screening technologies that will hopefully serve as a foundation for future discussions on control screening frameworks and optimization methodologies. So let's start by talking about the many ways that you can evaluate matching technologies, because there are an infinite number of ways that you can tackle this challenge. But any evaluation of solutions ultimately begins with this first question. Why is name matching so challenging for my organization? Right? So it's not just in general, why is it challenging, but why is it challenging within the framework of your specific organization? So let's go back to basics here. Personal names have characteristics that make them different from general text. While there's only one correct spelling for many words, there are often multiple spelling variations for names. You can couple this reality then with the challenges presented when customers or vendors are using nicknames such as Bob or Bill instead of Robert or William. There are issues with transpositions of surnames with first names. And then all of a sudden, the simple task of matching a name in your system against a name on a bad actor list becomes a topic for endless academic discussion. Something that I think the three of us here on this call today have realized, but realized very keenly in preparing for our talk today. Adding to this complexity then is the increase in multinational organizations. The reality is that globalization brings with it challenges of transliteration, which ultimately, and Michelle spoke to this, but what we're talking about there is the changing of letters from one alphabet into the corresponding similar sounding characters of another alphabet. And if we had more time, I think I would probably ask my colleague Michelle to sort of enlighten us on just some of the challenges with Russian, the Cyrillic alphabet. We kind of discussed that again, in preparing for our talk today, and it was really illuminating just how complex the issue of transliteration is, and the challenges, the very real challenges that it presents for our multinational customers here at LexisNexis. So believe it or not, addressing this simple, seemingly simple question in the context of the third parties you engage with, be it customers, vendors, or suppliers, will set you on the best course for selecting the name matching software best suited for your needs. If your customer base, for example, is 100% domestic with all anglicized names using a Latin-based alphabet, you will be less concerned with the system's transliteration capability. It's simply not functionality you'll need in your screening solution. And that's why it matters to first identify what kind of name matching challenges you're experiencing within the framework of your organization. So if you're new to the screening process, I urge you to ponder this question and let it serve as a foundation or a guide for your tools evaluation process. And if you already have a process and tools in place and you're simply not satisfied with the outcomes and the overall experience, consider going back to basics. Identify the name challenges you're experiencing in your screening process, and then evaluate those challenges against the screening solution's algorithms and functionality. You might discover that you've signed up for some major ship, cruise liner that's going to carry you across the Atlantic Ocean, when in fact the nature of your business just requires a nimble smart card to get you from point A to B very efficiently. So, and I think in that illustration, my point is that there are a plethora of screening solutions available on the market today, everything from the most basic exact name matching products to more advanced systems using fuzzy logic. But the truth is that the most sophisticated systems will take a hybrid approach to name screening to help you, again, achieve and overcome those name matching challenges. So let's take the LexisNexis Bridger Insight solution as our example. Bridger layers a number of methodologies and techniques to create one of the most precise name matching technologies available today. Bridger offers precision not only in real-time searches, but also provides the same degree of precision in large volume batch name screening. So at a high level, Bridger's search core takes a three-pronged approach to screening and provides scalable workflows to manage alerts efficiently within your organization's compliance protocols. That is a gross oversimplification of Bridger's search core, but again, we don't have all day to discuss this, so I just want to highlight really the key components that are driving the Bridger search core. So Bridger's search core algorithm begins by standardizing both the data input and the screening list data. And Michelle really touched on this in the first part of our conversation today. She laid out the foundation for the importance of vendor data and the challenges when you're not working with clean or standardized information. So Bridger accomplishes data standardization by first parsing out data into individual attributes, like first name separate from last name, separate from address and date of birth, and so on. And of course, this is all customizable to the client's particular set of data. The data is then analyzed and further standardized by removing special characters, replacing punctuations with spaces, and removing accent marks. After the data has been standardized, Bridger uses proprietary matching algorithms to find exact or close matches in selected fields by applying essentially a word-to-word comparison technique. These algorithms account for phonetic variations like Larson that can be spelled with an O versus an E. It also accounts for typographic variations, and this is probably just one of those that creates headaches situations for clients and for the audience. I'm sure you all have experiences with this. It's probably one of the most common headaches. But typographic variations is something as simple as leaving off the A of the name Angela turns it into Angel, a very different outcome. And finally, the algorithm accounts for alternate word variations like Mike versus Michael, or like my colleague on the line, the name of the usage of his name Charlie versus Charles. So the third and final component of Bridger's search core algorithm is a phrase matching technique. Now, consider what you see on the screen. On the left-hand side, you have the data input. You have Paulson as a first name and Robert as a last name. I think we can look at that, and it's a fair assumption here that we see transposition happening, right? Last name is actually listed in the first name field. On the right-hand side, what we see is a watch list entry. There is actually a person named Robert Paulson on a watch list. If you're using an exact name matching system, and that's the only thing that you're using, you're going to end up with a false negative situation, meaning no match will be found. So Bridger's search core, layering in this particular phrase matching technology, allows the system to see these two names, Paulson Robert and Robert Paulson, as a phrase, and it returns that as a fuzzy name match that now must be analyzed or reviewed by an analyst in order to determine, are we talking about the same person, and what course of action do we need to take? So all of this basic description here of the technology driving Bridger Insight Search Core is all great and good, but even the most sophisticated screening algorithm isn't sufficient on its own to meet out the requirements of an organization's unique risk appetite. To comply with screening requirements in the ever-changing, and Michelle, I think you really touched on this, ever-changing regulatory framework at a sustainable cost, because that's key, organizations need to periodically, 1, review their risk exposure, 2, adjust their risk tolerance as required by policy, and 3, leverage advanced screening solutions that can help them identify the sweet spot between regulatory risk, operation cost, and customer satisfaction. Now, right about now, you're seeing a slide, you're seeing a graph on the screen, and don't fret. I had sort of the same reaction when I saw this. There's a lot of data here, but really what I'm doing here, this is an illustration. It's a sample optimization exercise, and it's a representation of the kind of balance that can be achieved when you have the right tools in place. So this exercise, or this particular graph, was leveraged the advanced settings in Bridger's Intelligent Match Decision Solution, or we call this IMDS for short. IMDS is an advanced alert management system or solution, and essentially it's scalable enough to make it possible for an organization to fine-tune the relationship between false positives, false negatives, and operational cost. So as to directly achieve an organization's overarching compliance objectives. Now, I mentioned earlier, there will be more on the topic of optimization in future webinars. So this is just a little bit of a preview of future discussions, all really geared at helping and explaining how the right solutions can help you reach that sweet spot, that balance between these three critical points. So why does this matter? Why is fine-tuning your risk tolerance for false positives and false negatives important? According to Forbes and Ernst & Young, some organizations' screening process yield more than 90% false positive returns. I found that number staggering. I had some conversations with some colleagues who weren't as staggered as I was by that number, but that's an extraordinary burden, it seems to me, for a compliance department. So imagine the resources needed to dispense with a 90% false positive return rate. But this isn't the only issue. So the operational cost isn't the only issue created by high false positive rates. In recent years, there's been a pronounced shift in customer behaviors and demands in the banking industry. Overall customer satisfaction is key to gaining a competitive advantage in the financial market. So with false positives, you not only create strains specific around operation costs, but they also create friction in the customer journey that can adversely impact an organization's market share. We're really talking about profit margins here. So just like KYC has evolved, as Michelle shared with us, from basic KYC to KYCC and KYB, so has the approach to managing false positives. the name of the game is no longer as simple as the blind reduction of false positive return rates. It's true that it takes a significant amount of effort to sift through possible matches and make determinations on their true match status. And at the end of the day, simply put, this means that false positives cost you money. But the sort of knee-jerk reaction here, which is to set thresholds, the name matching threshold so high that you nearly eliminate matches from your view, can create a new kind of nightmare called the false negative. So while false positives are costly from an administrative perspective, false negatives can cost you not only your reputation, but they also carry potential criminal implications. This is why it is critical to select the screening tools that provide you the ability to strike the right balance between regulatory risk and cost. So, Charlie, I think we want to leave some time for Q&A. I'm going to pass this back to you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Lauren. I think that little last point there is a very interesting one of balancing the operational issues, the reputational issues, the regulation issues. As ever with these things, it's a very fine balancing act. I have to say that I was one of those slightly taken aback by that figure of 90% false positives in some screening regimes. Really doesn't bear thinking about the amount of workload that would create for you or for someone in that respect. And also, thanks for bringing my name in as an example. I am slightly lucky in that I have two names, in that I'm Charles and Thomas, so that gets even more confusing if you go to a Francophone country. But thank you very much to both of you for that. I'm now going to move on, if I can, to some of the questions that have been coming through while we've been talking, and rather glad to say there's quite a lot of them. So we will try and get through those as best we can. Some of these are on the inclusion pieces, I think, sort of for Michelle. And I wanted to try and tie two of them together, if I may, to start off with. The first one was asking what the opinion or the view on ultimate controller. Now, obviously, an ultimate controller being different to an ultimate beneficial owner. Does it matter how is it a good idea, and does it matter how much you identify the ultimate controller? And I think that ties in slightly with another question, which is on the percentage of ownership with state-owned entities, and how and whether we include that content. So, Michelle, there are two sort of linked questions, controller and then percentage of ownership. Could you address those two for me?
Sure. So, yes, ultimate controller does have, you say, more power, right? But that doesn't mean all the power. If you are trying to assess risk with an organization, I mean, ostensibly you want the fullest picture possible, right? But then depending on, who you're doing business with that's related to that company, it could be the ultimate controller or the UBOs. That's really going to determine, really what you care about in terms of assessing the risk. So I always like to have a fuller picture. So then you can also see the relationships between them, like how much does the ultimate controller actually have over over the company, how is that split up? And then that relates, as you said, Charlie, to the other question about percentage ownership or affiliation. So Lexus does show percentage ownership when it can be located. Not all the time. You will see a location of the actual percentages, but when it can be, yes, it's included with SOEs. In terms of PEPs, we do have affiliations and ownership in terms of PEP-owned businesses as well. And so you will see the ownerships and the ownership percentages when available, and affiliations when we can find them, and of course the sources that talk about those, that prove it.
Okay, thank you. That's excellent. One for you then, if I can, Lorena, which is coming on you're talking about the matching algorithms. And the question was about model validation. So what about model validation or independent validation to prove that a system is tuned properly? Is that something you can address briefly?
Yes, and it's something that if you're interested in that, highly encourage you to join us for the subsequent webinars in this series, because we're going to spend much more time going over model validation. And really a lot of that is what has driven at LexisNexis our development of IMDS. It's really designed to provide you the tools around creating that really finite tuning in your false negative rate versus your false negative rate compared to your operational cost. I'm not sure if that addresses the answer. I'm sorry, addresses the question. We really address that here through that particular advanced technology within Bridger. And again, we're going to have much more detailed conversations around that in future webinars.
Excellent, thank you. Another one, if I may, I'm going to try and tie in two of these together again for you, Michelle, if I can. The first, which, in fact, we'll do them separately. I think that they are sufficiently different. And the question is, a publicly known person who is a long-time friend of a high-ranked politician, can they be considered as a PEP? And it's a bit of an open-ended question, I think, but how would you address that?
I think very directly, actually. And if you look at FATF recommendation 12 and 22, it states point blank that if there is a friend of a PEP or an associate, a close associate, that they have to go through the same screening as the PEP. So you would show those relationships. Now, recommendation 12 also says, you know, the degree of friendship can depend on, and just same way, the degree of a family member or close associates can depend on many factors. You know, types of relationships, prominent members of a civil organization, business partners, and also in terms of how close family ties are will also depend on the culture as well. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned in my talk, this is understanding how deep the vendor goes and how deep it has to match how deep you go as well. But that definitely is covered in recommendation 12 and 22 of FATF.
Excellent, thank you. I think that's one of those lovely answers where you can just say a straight yes or no, which is always a good one. The second one is, again, unfortunately for you, Michelle, sorry to keep putting you on the spot, but it's this is slightly less of a yes or no answer, I think. At which point should a person who may be the subject of adverse media be reported to an FIU, and what criteria should be used to report such a person to FIU based on adverse media?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer it with any specificity. I can give processes around that. So obviously, as I pointed out, FinCEN has called out adverse media as something that you should screen against and take a look at, you know, who you're doing business with. And they're not the only ones. You see this mentioned in various regulation around the world for awareness. It really depends on your internal risk assessment and your risk threshold. And then, of course, it depends on the nature of the adverse media, right? So being able to take a look at that person's profile, that person's risk profile, matching it against your organization's regulatory risk appetite, and then seeing where that comes on the threshold. I mean, obviously, reporting is a very individual to the institution choice, right? Depends on those KYC methodologies, depends on the risk itself. But, you know, obviously there are some crimes that are going to be worse than others. I mean, if someone has been implicated in multiple money laundering schemes and has convictions or, multiple investigations, obviously that's going to be flagged higher. But I can't really say, yes, this is a definite point. This gets to suspicion, right? This is what everyone's trying to figure out. It's like, at what point do we reach that threshold of suspicion that justifies a report to the FIU? That is, as some of you may be aware of some of my own writings, that again depends on the institution itself. But if you document that and you have good processes for the risk, you can say, look, at this point, this is when we've crossed over that threshold. And that's really what regulators are also looking at. You know, can you prove why you made this decision, and is it consistent with your risk profile?
Excellent, thank you. That's, again, one of those that isn't quite so black and white, unfortunately. Lorena, if I can move on to you with a couple of questions now from people listening in. And the first is, you touched on that figure of 90% false positive rates. Now, I'm obviously duty bound to say that that's certainly not something we find within our own platforms. While it is obviously a very scary number to have out there, it's not something that we see. However, one of the questions that popped up is, how can we properly handle a false positive?
Sure. And I will say that if I'm going to precisely quote the Forbes article in particular, the article was very specific about legacy systems, legacy screening systems, which of course systems like Bridge or Insight are not. We've significantly advanced beyond just a legacy product. So how to manage a false positive? You really have to have policies in place around that. That's a question I get probably on a weekly basis, and we do have services that can help you with that. But one of the challenges with addressing that question directly is that there are ramifications to how you manage a false positive result, right? So we want to be careful about how we answer that question, and ultimately the answer is, how does your policy mandate that you manage false positives? What kinds of thresholds have you set? What kinds of workflows? You know, do you have a secondary review process? You know, have you tiered the third party that triggered that false positive, and, you know, are they tier 1, 2, or 3? Because each tier level will carry different requirements about how you handle that false positive. There's no simple answer to that. But we do offer services that can help, where we can actually sit down with the appropriate officers at an organization and really help them dialogue about their risk appetite, the types of risk thresholds that make sense for their industry, and you know, help them implement those policies as, you know, written documents, but also then tangibly mapping those back out to the screening process. Probably an infuriating answer.
No, it's not quite on the realm.
There's no simple answer.
There's not. It's not quite on the realms of a politician's answer. Yes, but, or no, but. So yes, but. If I can keep you going for a moment, Lorena, linked into some of the issues you're talking about names and variations, and I'm going to try and read out the question and hope I don't jumble any of the names and spellings. What if the name is Jacob John, and the watchlist AKA is a Jacob John, whereas the official name of the watchlist entry is Jacob Jennifer Hay, which is totally different from the customer name? Should we still consider an AKA name instead of the official name against the customer name? It's a bit convoluted, but I think the thing is, you know, what level of AKA do we need to be looking at, I think, is the question.
Again, not an easy answer, and I may actually leverage Michelle a little bit here in just a moment. So one of the things around that, and it's difficult for me to answer that question without talking about world compliance data, because the methodology used to create profiles within world compliance, you know, there's a specific section around AKA and the treatment of also known as fields, create a very different experience when you do trigger a result that is coming out of, say, the also known as field versus the primary name. There's a higher degree of reliability in that than there is just from a direct watch list necessarily, right? Because with world compliance, we're doing quite a bit of treatment of that information in the background. So my answer would sort of be the standard. Again, sort of depends on what your risk appetite and thresholds are. That should be the first driver, the size of the transaction, the risk levels based on geographies. You know, there's so many factors that you have to consider in making a determination about, if it's not an exact name match, do we really care? This isn't, this is a pretty low transaction, nothing considered like a smoking gun here. Let's just move on. It really kind of maps back to your policies. But Michelle, I don't know if you want to speak specifically to the world compliance, AKA field. I just know that experience is different when we're talking about world compliance versus other raw data.
So, there's several ways AKA is used in this sense, and honestly, it depends on the list, right? It depends on the data you're collecting. Like take, for example, there are some sanctions lists that give you multiple AKAs, and of course, clients want to screen against those AKAs in terms of a sanction for a sanctions list because of the risks involved in there, and that makes perfect sense. There's also AKAs that are entered, say, if we just find in a source someone is called by a different name, a nickname, right? And also, like the transliteration, you had referred to, the Russian variation names and spelling. So, like in Cyrillic, sometimes it'll be transliterated into Latin with different combinations. So, you'll find the different variations in that AKA because people will put I's and E's and U's and in places that you didn't, that wouldn't normally be if you're just looking at the Cyrillic. So I think it really depends on the list you're screening against and, of course, the risk according to the regulation.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I think I might say it was Muammar Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi, who was one who had probably the longest list of AKAs and alternate spellings of anyone listed anywhere. I'm fairly sure it was him who used to have aluminium as an AKA for some strange reason. I'm just going to finish, if I can, on one final question, which I'll let both of you take briefly, which starts off as a regulator. So I'm not sure that. I should point out we're not a regulator. I'm not entirely sure if the individual asking the question is a regulator, but we're not a regulator. It says, please can you describe how an effective audit trail is produced to show that data entry is accurate and a correct interpretation of the findings recorded? Lorena, do you want to take that one first?
Well, if I understand the question, that's going to be software specific, if I understood that correctly. The question is, how can you feel confident that the data entered, how do you create a trail of that? And so speaking to Bridger Insight specifically, there's a really dynamic view when you're looking at alerts that allows you to see across the top of the screen the data that was entered. So that data, that input data, always follows the alert view. That way you have that side-by-side comparison, right? It's never going to be a mystery to you that maybe you entered something you didn't mean to enter, and now you're triggering this alert that needs to be reviewed. We make that incredibly transparent throughout the entire process when you do trigger a result, and that information is written back to the Bridger database. So you do have that information stored for that electronic audit trail. But the answer to that question is really very software specific.
Thanks. Michelle, anything on that audit trail piece from you?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for this question. I really like this question. So audit trails are very, very important for a lot of the processes that I spoke before, right? I mean, especially when you're looking at quality assurance, okay? It's all about producing an audit trail there because, from my viewpoint, from the data methodology viewpoint, I've created, my team, this company has created some very solid and robust policies, okay, that are based on those regulatory needs on sound research, and you lay those out, and then you give them to your researchers, to your staff, and say, okay, we're going to train you on these. Again, you're having another measurable audit trail of how, in training, of how people have understood those principles, those inclusion principles in those policies. So that's one level of audit. And then after that, as you're measuring how well that they're doing that and actually executing it in the database, you can also pull that information and do checks on, are they adhering to those? Because you know, in terms of the data standardization and those policies and inclusion and your training, you know, what should be going where and why. Okay, so you're looking and should be able to report on, this is how you get your data-driven improvements, is I have that data, so I'm auditing myself, I'm auditing my own policies, and I'm auditing the behavior of others to show where people got it right and where people got it wrong, and how I can improve. So having those systems and processes in place where I can literally pull out the data and say, here are the trends on how people are actually applying these policies, is the audit trail where you could show people and say, this is not only the rules that we've set down, but here's how we're executing on them. And we can see those trends and improve on them.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, looking at the clock ticking against us, unfortunately I have to say that that concludes our webinar today on the effectiveness in KYC third-party due diligence. We do hope that you will join us, if you may, on future webinars where we're going to explore the optimization of control screening frameworks in more detail. And we do have a number of other webinars coming up on a wide variety of other topics. So there will be more on both our LinkedIn pages and other social media networks. In closing, I must reiterate the apology that we couldn't get to all of the questions we had. We had, unfortunately, almost an overwhelming number today, which was fantastic. Please do get in touch with any of us if you wanted to follow up individually. My thanks, obviously, to Michelle and Lorena speaking today, but also my thanks to all those of you listening in around the world, which has been quite an impressive spread of geographical locations today. So thank you both to speakers and attendees. And with that, farewell. Thank you.